Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be among you this afternoon. I know it's getting a little late. I'll try not to be lengthy. I have basically the impossible job of introducing St. Athanasius in about 45 minutes. So everything I'm going to give you is fairly selective. St. Athanasius is, as you can figure from the previous speakers, this is a topic of research, of lifelong research, and I'm not going to do him justice in these few minutes. St. Athanasius, as you know, is known as the father of orthodoxy, the canon of orthodoxy. He has a number of distinctions. If nothing else, in his early career, he writes the definitive work, or one of the definitive works on the full divinity of Christ. Later on, he writes the letters to Bishop Serapion, which are about the divinity of the Holy Spirit. Later on in his career, he writes against Apollinarianism and defends the full humanity of Christ. So when it comes to the Trinity and the divinity of the Trinity, well, he's crucial. He is definitely crucial. This afternoon I wanted to briefly go over a little bit of background material to the age of St. Athanasius. And then I wanted to give a very quick synopsis of his life. Then I was going to focus on two texts. The primary one, of course, being what's on your printed schedule, the life of St. Anthony, but also, to some extent, also on his writing on the Incarnation. Much of the discussion of this morning has been about St. Cyril, and going back a few generations earlier to the period of St. Athanasius, there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. In scholarship, as a rule of thumb, they usually kind of pinpoint the date 395. In 395, Christianity becomes the legal religion of the empire, and it's something of a different world after that. The 4th century in general is a period of tremendous conversion to Christianity. At the beginning of the period, beginning of the 4th century, Christians are a minority. By the end, they're approaching a majority in many places, and statistically, as far as most of the studies out there, by the early 5th century, in many places, Christians are an absolute majority. So at the time where St. Cyril is at the helm of the church, the majority of the population in Egypt are Christians. That is not the case for St. Athanasius. For St. Athanasius, it is important to keep in mind that he is dealing with a population that is a minority. The majority of the people in Egypt are pagans. The majority of the government are still following paganism. The majority of the Senate in Rome until the 5th century are pagans. The army, the overwhelming majority of the soldiers in the army are pagans. It is also a period that witnesses a very important and dramatic shift in the history of the church and the ethos of the church and the mentality of the church. The age of martyrdom, which he witnesses, comes to an end. And with that, monasticism begins, and it's very clear in both the life of St. Anthony and in the Pachomian writings that the fact that these individuals witnessed the martyrs, saw them going to their death, joyfully to their death, and the fact that they could not follow in their footsteps because once Constantine comes along, Christianity is legal, opportunities for martyrdom are gone. That longing, in a way, prompts them into what becomes the long martyrdom, the life of monasticism and virginity. There's also the Arian challenge that St. Athanasius deals with, and it's both theological and political to a large extent. The theological ramifications of it really comes from understanding how really logical Arianism is. Unfortunately, oftentimes, just kind of as a quick rebuttal, well, Arius said there was a time when the Logos was not, St. Athanasius said he was. In the story, let's move on. Arianism is much more nuanced. It is much more logical, if you will, than that would lead to believe. And it is very fortunate that the church had St. Athanasius and Hilary and a number of other fathers, but St. Athanasius, who addressed such a very difficult and logical heresy. And as we'll see as we go on, this idea of logic is one of the issues that St. Athanasius is really concerned with. What is truly logical? What is cogent? A big issue also with the life of St. Athanasius, we'll see, is his many exiles. He's been exiled by every emperor that ruled while he was alive, with the exception of one who apparently was Orthodox, but he was ruling for 8 months in any case. But Constantine the Great, unfortunately, especially during the later years of his rule, was under the influence of a bishop named Eusebius of Nicomedia, who was at least had some Arian sympathies. Constantius also followed his father's footsteps. Emperor Julian the Apostate, who was raised as a Christian but converted to paganism, certainly had no respect for St. Athanasius. Valens was, Jovian was the one emperor who ruled again for that 8-month period, and he restored St. Athanasius. And then Valens, perhaps the most famous of the Arian emperors of the East, and I should nuance this by mentioning that one of the interesting facets of this period of history is that the emperors in the East, and especially in the first half of the 4th century, tended to favor Arianism. Those in the West did not. Those in the West tended to be Orthodox, and some of the exchanges between the churches in the East and the West and Rome do have a political aspect to them. Rome was in the West under the patronage of Orthodox emperors, while many in the East were not during that period. It is also under Valens, I should mention, that the Germanic tribes convert, and they convert initially to paganism, to Arianism. In general, I'm just going to introduce this very quickly. The whole career of St. Athanasius and the period that he comes in is very important in addressing one of the things that comes up often in literature in various ways, which is the concept of Caesaropapism, this idea that the emperor is the head of the church and he dictates what happens in the church. And this thesis has many manifestations, some of them historical, some of them with regards to late Roman history. An aspect of it has been picked up in the modern period by various segments of evangelical Christianity, where the basic thesis is that everything was fine until Constantine came along, and with Constantine and the merging of church and state, deterioration set in. Very simply said, if that was truly the case, then St. Athanasius should not have been exiled 5 times. The fact that he is standing up to the emperor, he, Horosius of Cordoba, Ambrose of Milan, clear instances of bishops standing up against emperors when exactly. So this idea of Caesaropapism that kind of almost tries to negate Orthodoxy as almost a state-sponsored church cannot really stand simply on the basic facts of the life of St. Athanasius. I wanted to quickly also, in way of background, touch a little bit on the pagan background. Again, St. Athanasius is living and writing in a period in which pagans far outnumber Christians, and that is the case all the way through until his death. And I just want to introduce a couple of ideas, because it's clear in his writings that he has these things in the back of his mind. When he is addressing the pagans, on one hand it is apologetic, he is defending the church's teaching. But on the other, and we will see this as we progress, he is addressing them in a way almost to correct their errors. And on several occasions, he makes it very clear that he is inviting them, after these discussions, inviting them to accept Christianity and to accept Christ. Very quickly, pagans, usually referred to as Hellenes or Paganos and Ethnikoi in some cases. One of the interesting and fascinating things during this period is that within paganism there is a move towards a quasi-monotheism, what is known as henotheism. They begin to merge various deities into one manifestation. They, for instance, the god Helos, Sol Invictus, which is originally a Persian deity, Apollo, the Roman deity. They combine all of these into one. They start speaking of them as one. They're just simply different names for the same entity, the same deity. But one of the common ideas that they had, both in popular religion and in philosophy, is the second point I have up there. The ultimate deity is transcendent. The ultimate deity is beyond contact with the world. And this is important because this is one of the issues that's behind the background of Arianism. It is trying to substantiate this, that the ultimate deity to some extent is transcendent from creation. The lower deities can be manipulated, and one of the subtle things that you kind of need to have in the back of your mind as you read the life of Antony, as you read Christian literature of this period in general, is the double meaning of the word demon. Within Christianity and within the scriptures, demon is always bad. It's the devil. There's no positive spin to it. It's the fallen angel and his ranks. Within Greek thought, a demon was something of it's a spiritual being. It's kind of on the lower end of the spectrum, but it can be good. It can be evil. It's the closest equivalent actually comes from, at least the closest equivalent I know of comes from pre-Islamic Arabia when they talk about the jinn. The jinn there, it's a very similar concept where they can be good, they can be evil. You just need to know how to deal with them. And much of religion during this period was how do you control these demons. So there's kind of a double play here where in the pagan context it can be good or bad. In the Christian context, it's always bad. Syncretism. Syncretism is a fancy word for kind of a melting pot of ideas, cultures, everything. And we kind of touched on that with the Helios, Sol Invictus, Apollo analogy. Theurgy is a fascinating development of this period. Philosophers and the average pagan were looking for ways, practices, techniques that they can have contact with their gods. And this took various manifestations. Some of them kind of started to creep into the church, and the fathers condemned them. But there's a whole set of practices that come up in which the pagans are trying to have contact with their deities either through dreams or through oracles and the like. It becomes a fairly developed system. Finally, with regards to the afterlife, there was a very large spectrum. Pagans believed everything from there is no afterlife, there is nothing beyond this life, to Hades, Elysian Fields, Mount Olympus. In all, however, even those that believed that there is such a thing as an afterlife, they did not conceive of it in a physical matter. It was only your soul. Your soul would go on to the afterlife, not your body. So the concept of a body resurrection, the concept of the importance of the incarnation being truly physical, God actually becoming man, it simply didn't make sense for them, at best. And at worst, it was the exact opposite that, let me rephrase this, it would be antithetical to what God would really do, especially when you get into the Gnostics and Manichaeans. It makes absolutely no sense for God, pure spirit, to be enfleshed in this evil, defiled matter. Among the philosophers, the most important school of thought is that of Neoplatonism. And philosophy during this period is fascinating, because when you and I think about philosophy, we're thinking about guys who are just kind of stuck in their offices and contemplating things. Good old Descartes. Descartes sitting there with a cube of wax, contemplating it for weeks at a time, also high in opium. But sitting there, looking at a cube of wax and writing his treatise. During this period, philosophy, religion merged. True philosophy and true religion were seen to be one and the same pursuit, and for this reason, oftentimes in literature and Christian literature, you'll find Christianity being referred to as philosophy and as the true philosophy. Most important founder of the school is Plotinus, who writes the Enneads, or actually it's his disciple who writes it for him. And the 3rd century in general Intellectually, Egypt almost owned the 3rd century. Plotinus, in regards to philosophy, Origen, actually a schoolmate of his, they were taught by the same individual. When you look at the two together, coming both from Egypt, they are the two intellectual giants of the 3rd century. But Plotinus is also interested in this idea of theurgy. Beyond his philosophical speculation and reading Plato and commenting on Plato and the like, he and the school of thought that he develops will begin to view philosophy as a religion. And many practices will be similar. They will fast and pray before they read the books of Plato. They will, a number of them will take on vegetarianism. A number of them will, few, but it is noticeable, even lives of virginity. Rare among the pagan schools of thought, but even to that extent. He begins you can see kind of almost a chain of transmission, one teaching the other. If you look at Iamblichus there in 245, 325, he's a philosopher and he is writing on the mysteries. Again, this point I'm trying to get across of the merging between philosophy and religion. And just please keep that in mind, because as we go along in the life of Antony, there's a couple of incidents there that aren't going to make a lot of sense unless you keep this in the back of your mind. I should also mention that during this period, the pagans are shying away from sacrificing. They're now no longer enamored with this idea of taking bulls and oxen and the like up onto the altars, slaughtering them, blood squirting all over. It's becoming more refined. You can argue it's even becoming more spiritual, less tangible. And later on, as you can see with Decius, the teacher of Emperor Julian, comes into power. He reneges on Christianity. He accepts paganism. You would think that the pagan population would rejoice. But they didn't really like him much, because Julian wanted the paganism of the days gone by. He wanted to bring the oxen and slaughter as many cattle as he can. And to upstanding pagans of the period, that was just simply not the way we worship anymore. One of the famous commentators, historians about the reign of Julian, Ammianus, mentions that if Julian didn't die, Rome would run out of cattle. He was just killing so many every day, there would no longer be cattle. I wanted now very quickly to go over the life of St. Athanasius. We'll get to St. Anthony. The early life, we all know the famous story of the child by the sea. Pope Alexander notices a bunch of kids playing baptism by the seashore, but he notices that the boy who is acting out the part of the bishop is kind of doing it right. He's kind of doing it right. He has it right. He knows what he is doing. And it's at that point that he comes to the attention of the patriarch. The education of St. Athanasius is not altogether clear, because we don't have an exact reckoning of it. There's a lot of theories. One of them is that he was educated in the catechetical school. What is clear is that he was educated, and he was highly educated. And this is something that he is not unique in. Overwhelming majority of the patristic fathers, with the exception of a few who come from the monastic background, and even then, it's a mixed bag. Overwhelming majority are very highly educated. This is not by accident. Again, we're going to run through this very quickly. By 318, he wrote on the Incarnation, the pivotal text that discusses the divinity of our Lord and Savior. Council of Nicaea, he attends there with the main representative of our church being Patriarch Alexander. He is a deacon at this point. So he writes, if St. Athanasius did nothing else, on the Incarnation, 318, he is roughly in his 20s. We would still be talking about him today. A few years later, he is elevated to the episcopate, and a large story there that we don't have time to go through. The 5 exiles. I just wanted to kind of show you a span of his career and where he visited. during all these exiles, he goes all the way from Trier in Germany on the left-hand side there, the easternmost circle. He goes to Rome, to Milan, Mikhail, Constantinople, Egypt. The first two exiles are to the west. The others are in Egypt primarily. I wanted just to notice two things. One of them is the year 338, because this can be dated fairly well, and this is the visit of St. Anthony to Alexandria. This is when the Arians claimed that he is supporting them, and St. Anthony went and said, "No, I am not an Arian." Okay. The monastic fathers, with emphasis on spirituality, being separated from the city, so on and so forth, they did take their orthodoxy versus heresy seriously. The third exile, that is the one in Upper Egypt, and it's at that point, roughly within the first 2 years of that exile, it's at the point in which he writes the life of Antony, what becomes the canon of monasticism. I couldn't leave out 367. We were mentioning, again, the writings of St. Athanasius are just so vast, we don't have time to go through them, but the Festal letter of 367 is a crucial letter for the biblical canon. This establishes the biblical canon that we have until today, and the whole of Christendom, at least as far as the New Testament, has until today. It's also right after the second exile, from about 346 to 350. It's not altogether clear, but it's at that point, that juncture, that he ordains Bishop Frumentius for Ethiopia. And this establishes the link between Egypt and Ethiopia, a link that will last until the modern period, and a link that will be quite important throughout the Middle Ages. Once the Arabs come in, you'll have a fascinating dynamic between the Islamic government in Egypt, who has the Copts living under their rule, but the head of the Coptic church ordains and sends the head of the Ethiopian church, which are independent and until the 14th century are an independent military Christian kingdom adjacent to the caliphate. So there's a fascinating political, religious dynamic that takes place during that period. Very quickly, I want to just survey the audience of St. Athanasius, because it's clear in his writings that he really has a grasp of his audience. He is addressing them directly and indirectly oftentimes. For the Christians, you have the theologians, the clergy, the laity, the monastics, and the Arians, which are heretics, and the Meletians, which begin out as schismatics. The Manichaeans and the Gnostics, and unfortunately it's really in vogue nowadays to kind of include Manichaeans and Gnostics under the umbrella of Christianity. But if we can't even agree on who created the world, the reality of the incarnation, what exactly Christ did on the cross, I at least find it very difficult to include them under that umbrella. I think it compromised enough just including the Arians and the Meletians there. And pagans of various sorts. There is a whole spectrum of pagans, from your non-educated individual who kind of has the Greco-Roman myths handed down to them orally, to a fairly sophisticated lot, those of the Neoplatonists that we mentioned earlier. I now want to introduce the two texts that we'll be focusing on. Again, the main one will be the life of Antony, but there is an importance also to the incarnation. It is composed in 318, as I mentioned. There's some debate as to some other dating, later dating, but the consensus at least seems to rest on 318. It is the second part of a united work. Against the nations, or against the Gentiles, and on the incarnation, were originally one work and produced by St. Athanasius as one work. You can find kind of a very apt summary of it, actually in the opening pages to it. He says it very clearly: the renewal of creation has been wrought, or made efficient by the same word, the logos, who created in the beginning. And this kind of establishes the theme that he will run through in various manifestations. The text survives in Greek and Syriac, and this is kind of important because Greek and Syriac are the languages of education. They are the languages of theology, our own theological works. Much more of them survive in Syriac than in Coptic. And if you look at the post-Chalcedonian fathers, if you look at Severus of Antioch, at Theodosius of Alexandria, the bulk of their truly theological works are preserved in Syriac. And those are quite important. There's a huge emphasis, of course, rightly so, on St. Athanasius, the period from St. Athanasius through St. Cyril. But to understand the ins and outs of the Miaphysite Christology, you have to look at the post-Chalcedonian fathers. For our tradition, that is essential. The life of St. Anthony, again, written during the third exile, early on in the third exile, sometime between 356 and 58. Instant bestseller. Within a few years of its publication in Greek, it is translated in Latin. By roughly 360, 361 or so, there is a second translation into Latin, which is said to be much more prosaic and much more artistic. The first one is much more literal, and hence it's a bit more important for authenticating the Greek text. The edition there I have on the right, the Life of St. Anthony by Tim Vivian, that is the only English translation based on the critical Greek text. There is, if you go online and Google the Life of Antony, you'll come up with a number of translations. There's a number of other translations in print, but the only one based on Bottleneck's critical edition of the Greek text is this translation by Tim Vivian, and it includes also a translation of the Coptic life in facing pages. You can see the Coptic version and the Greek version. From the very beginning, again, he kind of establishes the theme that he will flesh out through the life. And St. Athanasius mentions, since you asked me, these are the monks abroad, probably from Gaul. Since you asked me about the life of the Blessed Anthony, in order to emulate his zeal, you'll also want to emulate his intentions. This idea of emulation, of imitation, is quite important for St. Athanasius. For him, the emulation of the saints is how new saints are made. The heretics are the ones that innovate. The heretics are the ones that stray and come up with their own opinions. But emulation here, and this is, don't be understanding this as kind of a blind copying per se, and understanding kind of the biblical form of St. Paul asking them to imitate me as I imitate Christ. But this imitation of the saints is a dominant theme for the saint. And it's this text that then promulgates St. Anthony to become the father of monks. And there's a lot of scholarly debate about whether he was the first or not, and so on and so forth. And to some extent, that's besides the point. Those living in Syria, even though there's, in academic circles, it's believed that Syrian monasticism developed at about the same time, but independently. But when you look at the early Syrian material, they're referring to St. Anthony. When you look at the Palestinian material, when you look at definitely the material from Egypt, they perceive St. Anthony as the father of this movement, this ascetic movement that now, rather than being in villages or in houses, is off in the desert. And that in itself has tremendous significance. The problem with discussing the life of Anthony is that in the life of Anthony you're dealing with two giants, and it's very difficult to separate them from each other. You have St. Anthony, the first monk, and you have St. Athanasius, the canon of Orthodoxy. Since I was asked to speak on St. Athanasius, I am, just for our purposes today, I want to focus on St. Athanasius' depiction of St. Anthony. And I want to qualify this a little bit further because unfortunately in modern academia there's a whole debate and there's a huge spectrum. Everything from St. Anthony is really a figment of the imagination of St. Athanasius to everything is absolutely correct. What I want to kind of flesh out with you this afternoon is how St. Athanasius depicted St. Anthony, because there is clearly some choices that he made. I want you just to think about yourself, and we're going to have a biography about yourself, and we're going to have 3 people write it. Your mother is going to write one, a friend that you made at college is going to write one, and your brother, your sister is going to write one. Clearly, each version, even though it's about the same individual, it will be a little bit different. They will focus on different things. Your mother is going to say, well, they were all just the best child ever. Your brother, your sister, maybe they held a grudge to that day, and when you were 4 or 5 and you took a toy away from them. So, each of them has different access to information. Each of them will organize material differently, and each of them will focus on the material differently. And each of them having a different educational background, the work is going to be polished to one extent or the other. So there will be certain differences. And what I want to focus on is really how the story of St. Anthony was relayed by St. Athanasius, because there's a lot there. There's a lot there to say. Now, initially, I want to kind of compare the 2 texts. Okay? And on the face of it, there really isn't much of a comparison. They're written 40 years apart. In one, on the Incarnation, it is written by the young deacon, by the life of Antony. It is the Pope of Alexandria, who is in his 3rd exile. The first is very theological. The second is kind of classified as an ascetical text. It's much more approachable. To some extent, you can argue that one is somewhat elitist, the other one might be much more popular. Remember, on the Incarnation only exists in Greek and Syriac. Okay. So the Coptic population, and after that, once Arabic dominated the Near East, they don't really have direct access to this text. The life of Antony, as you've seen on the previous slide, has been translated into every language of the region. Greek, Latin, Coptic, Syriac, Georgian, Arabic, Ethiopic. It is a very popular text. So in one regard, it's difficult to compare the 2. On the other, however, there is the same theological content. He highlights who are lacking reason. The devil is lacking reason. It cannot share in this image of the Logos. The pagan philosophers, heretics and heresy, by definition, lack reason. And this is important on a number of levels. For one thing, especially when you kind of read it within context and on the Incarnation in general, I alluded previously to the education of St. Athanasius, and there's clear understanding, if nothing else, of Stoicism, how the concept of the Logos within the Stoic philosophical system functions. Excuse me. Then he will flesh this out. In reason. How could men be reasonable beings if they had no knowledge of the world and reason of the Father through whom they had received their being? In the life of St. Athanasius, so in the Incarnation, he sets up the theological principle. It's almost logical. They do not share the Logos, therefore they cannot have the reason. In the life of Antony, he mentions that the demons, mimicking the forms of irrational beasts, they cannot mimic the form of rational. They have to be irrational. They have to be foolish, as you only demonstrate your weakness. Again, this idea that the demons do not share in this image. Heresy is irrational because it lacks reason. In the first attack against St. Anthony, kind of setting up the stage, what the devil tries to do, the devil, lacking reason, tries to impart that on humanity as well. He raises up a dust cloud of thoughts, wanting to separate him from his ability to make correct choices, from his ability to reason. To some extent, and I need to pursue this further, but within logic, there is categories of logical versus cogent. Just because something is logical, that doesn't mean that it is necessarily cogent. Just very quickly, this is a very bad example, but if we say that all clergy have beards, Tim does not have a beard, Tim is not clergy. it follows, it's kind of logical, but it's not cogent, because Tim could be newly ordained, maybe he just doesn't grow a beard. I mean, there could be a billion reasons to why that is so. It's logical, but it's not cogent. Here, it sounds like St. Athanasius is adding a third category. It can be logical, can be cogent, but that doesn't necessarily make it reasonable. And this idea of reason, he keeps on coming back to again and again. Theological context in the Incarnation in very concrete terms, almost, if you read it quickly, you're going to miss it because it reads much of the life of an Anthony kind of reads like a pious story, but there are these themes running through it. Philosophy, and I'm going to come back to this point over and over again because there is a section of about 8 paragraphs in the life that is very crucial to this topic. In the Incarnation, St. Athanasius points out the foolishness of philosophers, how the philosophers, relying exclusively on their reason, have led themselves astray and have led their communities astray. In the life, again, kind of being a more practical manual, St. Anthony is there debating with the philosophers, proving to them that they are illogical, that they are the foolish ones. And there's a great play on irony here with the philosophers going to St. Anthony to prove them wrong because they are the highly educated ones, and St. Anthony is this foolish peasant. They go there, and as you read the text, it's the philosophers don't have anything to say. The whole thing is St. Anthony proving to them through various means that they are misled. There's also the demons. There's a great part of the life of St. Anthony about the demons. On the Incarnation, he mentions that to speak authoritatively to evil spirits, for instance, and to drive them out is not human but divine. Okay. So the ability to do this, he is saying that if an individual can do this, he says that they can, but if they can do this, this is a link to the divinity of the Logos, the recreation, the restoration of humanity. In St. Anthony, again, you have a couple of other references at the very top there, but the young Anthony, this is fairly early on in his ascetic career. You can see how bold he is with the devil. You are a despicable wretch. You are black of mind. You are a frustrated child. Again, you are not mature. You are not reasonable. From now on, I'm not going to pay any attention to you, for the Lord is my help, and I shall look upon my enemies. The devil was afraid, and of course, the Lord is my help, I shall look upon my enemies. That's from the Psalms. The devil was afraid to come near the man anymore. And there, the second reference on the Incarnation, no such evil spirit can endure that name. This is the work of one who is alive and not dead. So here, the first reference on the Incarnation is probably towards Arians, or it's kind of substantiating the full divinity of Christ. The second has to deal a bit more with pagan attacks against Christianity. Both of them answered in, again, kind of an almost story-like manner in the life of St. Anthony. The cross, the power of the cross, one of the persistent themes, the recurrent themes throughout the life of St. Anthony. And St. Anthony is constantly employing the cross. In the Incarnation, again, St. Athanasius, 40 years previously, put down the theological understanding of it. By the sign of the cross, on the contrary, all magic stayed, all sorcery confounded. In the life, he presents concrete examples of St. Anthony through the power of the cross, stopping the two, bringing the two to confounding the two. The theory, the theology, the actual manifestation of it, both of them coming together. Christology, and this is really kind of the tip of an iceberg because there are numerous references here. But in a couple of cases, just the language itself is quite identical. In the Incarnation, Christ is revealed as God and Son of God. This phrase, God and Son of God, appears repeatedly in the life of St. Anthony. It appears repeatedly in theological texts, and it appears also repeatedly in the writings of St. Shenouda of Atrip. In Coptic, he is borrowing this theological phrase, and he is using it over and over again in his text. He's the very Son of God, having his being from the Father, whose word and wisdom and whose power he is. Again, in the life, power of God the Father. So even the terminology, not just simply the general idea that, yes, Christ is a Lord, Christ is God, but even the terminology itself is there. And of course, the incarnation itself. Those paragraphs I mentioned about the philosophers, that encounter is from about paragraph 72 to paragraph 80. But paragraphs 74 to 76 are really kind of the core of the issue. And if you just read the incarnation and go and read those two paragraphs, you will be amazed at the similarity between them. Phrases, sentences, almost verbatim. I just kind of, again, just brought up some examples. But especially those three paragraphs, the similarities between them are quite striking. And St. Anthony St. Athanasius in the both works criticizes pagan gods and philosophers again with this idea that they are irrational, not because they're illogical, they're very smart people, but because they lack the word, they lack the logos. They rebuke the pagan gods, which is a fairly daring tradition that goes back all the way to the apologists in the Christian tradition. I mean, the attack against the pagan deities is actually quite striking. Again, keep in mind that Christians are at this point are still a minority compared to the pagan majority. And then again, one of the jewels in the text, both in the life of St. Anthony and in the incarnation, who has for our sake and salvation assumed a human body, so that having participated in human nature, he might make us humans participate in divine and spiritual nature, which he puts even a small version in the incarnation, for he became man that we might become gods or divine. What we mentioned in the Christology, he took what belongs to us and gave us what belongs to him. At the end of the encounter with the philosophers, St. Anthony performs miracles and he makes the sign of the cross. And this is kind of why I put you through that whole deal with philosophy at the beginning. Because if you just look at this, it's going to seem illogical. He's discussing things with philosophers, and then all of a sudden he is performing miracles. To our modern understanding, that's not quite a convincing proof. What has to be kept in mind is that these philosophers that are approaching him are fully engaged in this worldview that we mentioned earlier. Theurgy, having contact with the divine, miracles as a proof for this divine aspect. Pagan holy men become famous individuals for performing miracles, some of which are similar to those in the Christian scripture. So this miracle at the end is not only appropriate within its context, but it's actually quite important, because St. Athanasius now and St. Anthony in his encounter with these philosophers, after proving them wrong, if you will, they are pursuing theurgy. They are pursuing direct contact with God. He demonstrates to them that this is the true religion. If you are looking for miracles as proofs, well, here you go. These are the miracles that cannot be rebuffed. The core of both texts, to some extent, is the reality of the incarnation and the full divinity of Christ are essential for salvation. The full divinity of Christ comes up in both of them. St. Anthony, the demons would not be afraid of St. Anthony had he not put on the new Christ, the second Adam, who is the image of the first. For St. Athanasius, all of these issues are interlinked. A knowledge of their Maker is for men the only real, happy, and blessed life. And this kind of becomes the nucleus within later patristic theology and text, this idea of humans being truly human only when they are in communion with God. As long as you are out of communion with God, out of connection with God, you are not quite human. Human proper, soul, body, spirit, in communion with God. The link between the two texts is this idea of renewal. Okay, and this will kind of lead us into the ending section of my talk today. But on the incarnation, after St. Athanasius sets up the story and with the fall, he then poses the rhetorical question, what then was God to do? What else could he possibly do, being God, but renew his image in mankind so that through it men might once more come to know him? And St. Anthony then becomes that renewed creation. St. Anthony is the new creation through which others, both Christians and pagans, will come to know Christ. With that in mind, now we'll kind of leave on the incarnation in the background now. But this idea of St. Anthony as an image of Christ in the life of Anthony comes up not infrequently. Christ heals the sick, so does St. Anthony, expelled the demons. People clamor to touch him. With the menstruating woman, she wanted just to simply touch him. That is in the life as well. Anthony is the new Adam. He has put on Christ. The section with the demons actually offers a number of examples. The first one there I find fascinating because in the first one, the devil kind of goes to St. Anthony and complains. It's quite a fantastic story. It's a great story because he's not there really to tempt St. Anthony, at least not directly. But he's there and complaining, what did I do to all these Christians? How come they're bad-mouthing me everywhere? What did I ever do? And St. Anthony tells him, well, why don't you leave them alone? The part where he walks on the sea, Christ walks on the sea, and on the incarnation he mentions that he walked on the sea as on dry land in paragraph 18. In the life of St. Anthony wants to cross the river, and then the crocodiles are there, and miraculously he walks over the backs of the crocodiles. Now, I haven't done it personally, but I imagine walking on the backs of crocodiles. It's similar to walking on dry land. They don't retain water very well. But the same imagery, the same concept comes through. Another issue has to do with St. Anthony as an image of Christ and entering the desert. Now, this kind of gets lost a little because much of the life of St. Anthony is in the desert. But here, really, the focus is on the very opening paragraphs. Entering the desert is reminiscent of Christ. The desert, within ancient Egyptian theology, within Hebrew thought, even within pagan thought, the desert is where the demons live. You don't want to go to the desert. If nothing else, I mean, you can't live there. There's no food and water, but this is also where the demons live. The same way that Christ entered the wilderness, St. Anthony enters the wilderness. The same way that Christ was tempted and overcame, again, St. Anthony is tempted in the desert by various means and overcomes. And after that initial stage, then you have kind of a more public, we can say, version. It's much more clear within the Gospels because the public ministry of Christ begins at that point. But with St. Anthony, it's a bit ironic because he kind of goes from discipline to discipline, becoming more austere at every step. But as St. Anthony remarks often, the irony is that he keeps on getting more and more famous. The deeper into the desert that he goes, the more famous abroad he becomes. And then there's the case of the tomb. Again, this is during the very early phase. St. Anthony's in the tomb. It's a two-part sequence. He's in the tomb, he is beaten up, literally beaten up by the demons. His friend finds him half dead, takes him out of the tomb. St. Anthony wakes up, he finds himself in the local village church. He goes back into the tomb, closes the tomb again. And it's almost, again, this idea of demons being foolish, demons being weak. St. Anthony even while being beaten by them, he tells them, if you had any power, one of you would be enough, rather than getting all of these hosts of demons against me. Then comes this pivotal point. Again, this is after he's been out. He comes back in again. Looking up, Anthony saw the roof appear to open and a beam of light descend upon him. Suddenly, the demons vanished and the pain of his body immediately ceased, and his dwelling was once again whole. And he finds that his body is whole. So Anthony goes into that second time, enters the tomb, half dead, and comes out whole. with this light beaming down. This incident is quite important on a number of levels. For one thing, this idea of all of these monsters coming out of the walls, and the description is very graphic. This can be understood in a number of ways. If nothing else, he's an Egyptian tomb. There are Egyptian gods painted on the walls, and Egyptians were very fond of animals. So these are the Egyptian gods almost, what the Christians believe are the demons, the bad demons, that the pagans believe are deities, and that theme runs through. The same association was also made with Greco-Roman gods, Zeus being a snake and a bull and the like, and all of these animals. It's almost a confrontation between Christianity and paganism, and Christianity wins. The incident, this is really kind of one of my favorite incidents in the whole text, and the incidents actually it kind of dawned on me not too long ago that St. Athanasius is doing something even more here. If any of you came from St. John's, Buna Gargios, one of his favorite verses in confession and in sermons, that verse from Micah, "Do not rejoice over me, my enemy. When I fall, I will get up. When I sit in darkness, the Lord shall be a light unto me." St. Anthony had fallen. Again, that first encounter in the tomb. He gets up and he drags himself back into the tomb. He is sitting in the closed, dark tomb, being beaten by the enemies. And at that point, as is very apparent in the text, the Lord becomes literally a light unto him as he is sitting in darkness. And one of the problem with the fascinating thing with the Bible and St. Athanasius and the life of Antony is that on one hand you have verses that are quoted directly, and those you can kind of look at the appendix of the book and kind of figure out how many verses, and there his scholars have numerated over 200 verses that are used just in that one text. But there's a lot of stories that clearly St. Athanasius has biblical narratives in the back of his mind. St. Anthony is the new Adam, the inner desert. Again, this theme of renewal, and I'll go back to the incarnation, which is a major theme there. This is explicit in paragraph 50, but there's a couple of other incidents. This is when he goes into the inner desert. He goes into the inner desert, and he finds an oasis, a garden in the middle of the desert, the inhospitable desert. And he plants a garden, plants vegetables. He commands the animals to obey him. And even the dangerous animals obey him and leave. I mean, this is just everything that St. Athanasius mentioned in the incarnation, this renewed humanity, this new Adam. St. Anthony is living out in his life. He's in the garden. Even the animals answer to him as Adam was in Genesis. And he's vegan. The only thing that he eats, only mentioned bread, the vegetables that he grew, and the palms that grew there wild. And there's this association with the vegan diet and kind of the diet of Adam and Eve prior to the fall. In the inner desert, St. Anthony, having surpassed that trial, the initial trial, he is the second Adam. Evangelism. There's also an implicit theme of evangelism throughout the life of Anthony. As we mentioned when we discussed the audience, St. Athanasius is very keen about who his audience is, and he understands, and he knows, and he almost, I think, hopes that non-Christians would read the text. St. Athanasius kind of does something similar with the text. On one hand, the text converts men and women to monasticism, and it's been doing that for the past, almost 1700 years. St. Anthony, while he was alive, he clearly, as the life mentions, when people met him and encountered him, they were attracted to monasticism. But the text now becomes that lure to monasticism. It also is a lure to non-Christians. the life of Antony was indeed read by non-Christians who converted. The most famous, of course, Augustine, who in his Confessions goes into detail about how really he was kind of on the brain column, so kind of thinking about Christianity, and it's the life of Antony that pushed him through. But when you look at the account carefully, he mentions that he wasn't the only one. There were others prior to him who read the life and were converted to Christianity because of that. And later on in the Western tradition, Thomas Aquinas. The text also plays an important role in the life of Thomas Aquinas. At the very end, again, St. Athanasius is clear of this, and I would like to argue that this here is explicit, but throughout the text it is implicit. When he is, especially in that section where St. Anthony is encountering the philosophers, and he is rebutting the arguments of the philosophers. This is St. Athanasius in the back of his mind saying, well, if these are their arguments, if this is why they're not accepting Christianity, this is why the arguments are false. And I should actually mention that 9-paragraph section, it begins and ends with St. Anthony calling upon the philosophers to join Christianity, to accept Christianity. But at the very end, it's explicit. Either read this also to pagans, so that they may too, that same way that not only is our Lord Jesus Christ God and the Son of God, again, that term that comes from the Incarnation, faithfully believe in him, are repudiating the demons whom the pagans themselves believe to be gods. Again, this understanding of demons in the Christian versus the pagan context. The dialogue with the philosophers. It is quite a fascinating segment. The focus is on the Incarnation. Again, it's almost an encapsulation of the work on the Incarnation. So if he wasn't able to get the message across to the popular audience with the more theological work, he actually got the exact same bit of information through in this more popular work. As I mentioned, the section begins and ends with St. Anthony calling upon the philosophers to convert. And here, you find that in both texts, St. Athanasius is really in touch with the arguments of his day. He is, unfortunately, oftentimes, this is kind of lacking in the present period. Why this, why that? Because that's the way it is. That's the answer you get. St. Athanasius, very, very much in tune with the arguments of his period and providing clear, cogent rebuttals to the arguments of his adversaries. The life in general is a guide to asceticism, and here I wanted to pause for a minute. After the age of martyrdom closed, there was kind of a switch, if you will. The age of martyrdom was fairly egalitarian, if you will. You can be a mother of 7. If you're martyred, you are among the martyrs, you are first rank, if you will, the front row seating in heaven. Now, there has always been an emphasis on virginity. There's always been an emphasis on asceticism within the church, even during the period of martyrdom. But it seems that after the period of martyrdom, the separation became much more cemented. Within the life of St. Anthony, when you look at asceticism here, how he defines asceticism, it's not necessarily associated with sleeping on the ground, eating 2 grains of rice per day, and forsaking marriage. And for him, fasting, keeping vigils, prayer, gentleness, tranquility, poverty, moderation as an ascetic practice. Because again, we think of ascetic practices as these kind of sleeping on the ground and going around barefoot and what have you. Moderation, humility, love of the poor, almsgiving, the absence of anger, and above all, devotion to Christ. On one hand, the life of Antony is, one of the canons of, the first canon of monasticism. But on the other, it's a canon to the Christian life. None of these virtues are really exclusive to monks. None of them are exclusive to the celibate. It is a manual of spiritual warfare. And there is a fairly lengthy section on demons. And unfortunately, some modern scholars really kind of completely miss the point. The reason that St. Anthony is going on and on about demons and the warfare of demons is because of spiritual purposes. These are the challenges you will encounter as you progress in virtue. And he wants to, I think the text here reads fairly at face value. He wants to tell his children, hey, these are the obstacles you're going to face, so be prepared. And this manifestation of theology, a proof of orthodoxy. Again, for St. Athanasius, on the Incarnation providing the theological aspect, St. Anthony's life being the more pragmatic, tangible, more reader-friendly version. That mean you want me to go on for 5 more minutes? Or I'm almost done. I'm almost done. But the life being this manifestation of theology, the themes interlock here for St. Athanasius. If St. Anthony did not put on the new Christ, if he was not the new Adam, he could not have put fear into the demons. And if the new Adam was not fully divine, Anthony could not have put fear into demons. There is, that old saying, it's very colloquial, the proof is in the pudding sort of thing. For St. Athanasius, the fact that St. Anthony became the second Adam, the fact that demons trembled at him, the fact that he healed, the fact that animals obeyed him, that proves the reality of the Incarnation, the full divinity of Christ, and it proves everything that he argued on the Incarnation. Now we'll stop here. Thank you. If not